Okay, hello to all of you listening from home. We were talking about surrealism last we met on Friday. Do you realize we have only 4 more classes after this one? Right? Yahoo! You're taking a test. You told my wife this as well. You're taking a test, young lady. How are you going to do a potluck and take an exam?
We did a potluck before.
You didn't take an exam before.
Can we get skip the exam?
We should do a potluck and skip the exams.
We could do a shorter exam. You should give us ample time. Yeah.
I should give you the answers. Is that what you said?
No, you should grade us on what we want to.
I should want to grade you like on style and hygiene. Just that you bring that in. No. Listen. Do you know what happens when I don't give an exam? You don't take notes and you don't learn. I mean, I'm serious about this. Through the decades of teaching, I've taught classes where there's not an exam and students do not engage with the material in a serious fashion. Period. I mean, it's just, it sounds very judgmental, but it's true.
Well, you can tell us, the people that aren't here,
I'm recording it now. You're on the record. There will be an exam. I want you to spend the time before the exam studying for the exam and not layering a lasagna. So is mine. We will do a blind side-by-side taste test. We'll see who makes a good lasagna. Okay, let's surrealism, right? We were talking about the fact that surrealism is a movement in Paris that sort of picks up the scraps of Dada, right? A lot of artists moved to Paris, as artists are wont to do throughout history, right? So, we look back before the war and we can see this happening. People go to Paris, right? Especially artists. And a number of artists had moved to Paris after World War I was over, 1919 onward, to make their careers there, including, Duchamp went back for a little bit, right? That's where he got the Mona Lisa postcard. Man Ray moved there, right? We talked about him. Max Ernst moved there as well. A lot of Dada artists moved there in around 1920 or so. Miro moves there around the same time, 1920 or so. And even though Miro's not really part of the Dada movement, this whole group of artists gets swept up into surrealism after 1924, right? Because remember that surrealism as a movement doesn't exist prior to, in any sort of organized fashion. It doesn't exist prior to 1924, right? That's when it takes on organizational cohesion. Although many of these artists had been working prior to that in ways in which seem, in retrospect, to be very much in keeping with surrealism, right? So this work predates the surrealist movement, but we can still talk about it as a surrealist work, because when Breton sits down to write the Surrealist Manifesto about the importance of dreams, right, and analyzing them, coming out of that sort of Freudian idea, right, when Breton writes that and figures out ways in which artists and writers can tap into the subconscious more directly, it's not coming out of nowhere, right? That's not just happening in a vacuum, right? Those ideas that he's interested in are ideas that he's seeing happening around him. So, there is this idea of surrealism starts in 1924, but there's a lot of stuff there going on that Breton sees when he writes the manifesto that inspire him to look at. So Miro's, this is pre-surrealism, but we still sort of talk about him because the majority of his career is surrealist, right? And it is surrealist because in many ways it's this family farm, but at the same time it's very mysterious, right? Things going on. He sees supernatural forms in natural elements. And he bridges the real with the supernatural, right? And again, all these terms that mean the same thing, right? That have the same Latin roots. Supernatural, surreal, metaphysical, right? They all mean the same thing, looking to something beyond the observable physical world around you, right? So you might expect, and we'll see, that the surrealists loved people like Kandinsky, who's already doing that, right? Well, in this case, it's a much more palpable sort of direct link, and I think that's true for a lot of surrealism, and there's kind of a more palpable direct link. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So here, those weird footprints that we talked about that disappear, right? Whoever made them isn't there anymore, and that person is nowhere to be found unless it's that weird idol, and maybe the idol's not sitting on the ground, but bouncing in air. There's nothing to ground it there. There's no shadow cast by it, right? Well, there's no shadow cast by anything, really. But there's nothing to say that that idol behind the woman has to be on the ground next to the pail. Why can't it be hanging in air next to the tree? Right? You don't know. But our dog seems to be barking toward it, which kind of suggests the idea of hanging in air. But again, it's just strange, right? And the bark on the tree, as you can see, becomes this sort of biomorphic form. Anamorphic is maybe better because the tree already is biomorphic, right? Anamorphic, in other words, becoming physically alive like a mammal, right? There's just something about it that suggests insect parts, legs of of a stick beast or something like that, right? And even that large weed that's growing on the path has a sort of anamorphic quality. So he's seeing things in natural forms. You'll notice that the tree with those leaves that come down sort of like the ends of a mustache of a villain in a silent movie, They get picked up by the moss that's growing on the building, the farm on the left. And they have themselves a sort of anamorphic tendency as well. Everything kind of seems alive. And we left off at the end of class looking at this detail from the wall and seeing these cracks with it's either water stains that have come out of it from rain, or maybe people have suggested it's moss growing from the wall. But they take on a life of their own. They have a sense of being something that is not just inert plant form, but living, moving animal form. And in this early work by Miro, what we have is many of the seeds of ideas that he will develop later in his career. And in particular, after Surrealism begins in 1924, Miro gets totally swept up into it and begins to do automatic painting. Remember what we talked about with automatic painting? Was this idea like automatic writing, which is where you just start to paint open form. No idea what you're painting, you're just letting your implement, your brush or your pencil, you're just letting it drift over the paper or the canvas. And seeing where that open start's going to lead you, and the idea is that you look down at the open start, the thing that's just happening, as you let your arm wander uncontrolledly. Is that a word? It is now, right? You let your arm wander without trying to control it, and then you see what's happening and say, okay, now I can develop those ideas. And this comes out of Freudian psychology, about automatic writing, about free association speaking. You just say words, and if you don't try to control what those words are, what they're going to really reveal is not your logic, right? Your reason, your control. What they're going to reveal instead is your subconscious. What's going on behind the curtain, right? So writing can do that as well. So says the theory. Painting can do that as well, right? And that's what Breton came up with, and we saw with André Masson, that idea of just dribbling paint onto the canvas in an open form that he then develops. Well, Miro starts to do this as well, and his paintings become increasingly more abstract because he starts to practice this idea of automatic painting, where he's scrubbing at the canvas, right, with varying tones of ochre in this particular case, coming back with these lines that then turn into something for him. And so in this case, he calls it the head of a Catalan peasant. The red bit at the top that's partly filled in is based on the form of a traditional peasant's hat in Catalonia, the part of Spain that he's from, down near Barcelona, right on the French border, right? That's where Picasso came from as well, by the way. And when Miro moved to Paris, he looked up Picasso, right? And he was kind of inspired by that whole idea of you can go there and kind of make it, right, in Paris as a Spanish artist. So if that's the hat at the top, that bell-like form, maybe a horn-like form, like a trumpet or something, then the rest of it is the face. So the bits on the sides are the eyes connected by a line going across, the line down the middle, the center axis of the face, the bit at the bottom, a mouth with a mustache perhaps, right? And you can see that the forms that he chooses for at least the mustache part is a direct translation of some of the forms that were on the side of the farm, right? But now he's turned them more abstract, turned them more automatic, right? But those forms stay back there, part of the memory of a past for him. And again, remember that surrealism is deeply embedded with, deeply wedded to psychoanalysis, and in particular Sigmund Freud. And Freud's psychoanalysis rests on two basic areas of study that lead us to self-understanding and self-awareness. And one is dreams, the other is childhood, right? These are the places one looks. And so Miro's childhood farm, right, where he grew up, where he convalesced, fighting off a fever, right, near death, if you will, feverish and visionary, becomes in many ways some of the ideas that we see develop in the rest of his works. You'll also notice in the farm how strong a role is it the sun or the moon plays. The tonality almost suggests a moonlit scene, even though the red of the foreground suggests daytime, right? But the celestial bodies play an important role even there. And this will continue through all of Miro's career, because for someone who's interested in surrealism, metaphysics, right, the celestial world, realm, right, the heavens, moon, stars, sun, these are all important elements because they're not part of our physical world in the same way, right? They float above us. They move around us, outside of our everyday experience, really, even though we can see them. And I think we all kind of became aware of this. I mentioned this yesterday in the intro, right? How, I don't know, that eclipse really hit me. I'd been through one before, but it was cloudy. Like I'd been through a total one time in Oregon back in '79. Back when they made the strange movies Margaret was talking about. And, it was cloudy, so it wasn't the same effect of just like you're floating in space somewhere. You became very much aware of that, right? So for Miro, celestial bodies will become increasingly important because what he sees painting is as a way of getting away from this realm and moving. He even calls it a ladder sometimes, a ladder to the heavens, moving from this realm to the next. So if we look at the head of the Catalan peasant, you'll notice the rainbow, the star, and with the rainbow looking almost like a shooting star. So a star falling from the heavens, bridging those two different realms. These little dots, lower right corner, upper left corner, that also maybe suggest stars in the sky, right? Floating around the figure, and the figure itself. It's almost like this is totally a anachronistic reference, like a Sputnik or something, it looks like a satellite, a man-made satellite, which didn't exist in 1924, right? But those lines coming off to the side look like antenna. There's something, again, and antennas suggest the radio, right? Transmissions that are real but not real, things you don't see, right? And we've seen in other artists how important that is as a metaphor. Think of Malevich, who is very much interested in flying and radio waves as symbols that there is something beyond the things that we just see day in and day out. A couple of nice details. Some of the holes are actually poked in the canvas. They're actually holes that he went and took something sharp and pop, pop, pop. And I need to go back and look at it again at the NGA to see which ones there are. I read about it once, and I realized that I don't have a good picture that illustrates that. But just take it on the National Gallery's expertise, that some of the holes that we see are in fact punctured holes. And there's a close-up of our star and our rainbow of sorts, right? Yellow, red, and blue, the primary colors of the rainbow, suggesting both the shooting star and and again another celestial event, if you will, right? So Miro very much interested in art as a way of bridging the physical world and the supernatural, right? Allowing us a conduit, or as he even calls it, a ladder from here to there. And this interest in art that allows this sort of escapism, right? Art as escape, escaping the physical world. For Miro, that idea increases in the 1930s because Miro is a Spaniard, and in the 1930s, Spain becomes embroiled in the Spanish Civil War, right? Against Franco, who is in league with the Nazis by the end of the 1930s. Right? He's a fascist and oppressing the Spanish people, in particular, really cracking down on resistance, which tended to be among the people of the smaller towns, right? People that might be, for example, a Catalan peasant at one point back. And so Miro becomes increasingly interested in this idea of art as a ladder of escape, a way of moving from this world to the next to flee the horrors of our world. And again, we've seen at other occasions where war inspires artists to think about an art that is more spiritually focused. And for Miro, that spiritualism becomes the heavens. Now here I think we can see, right now this is 14 years later, so it's the middle of the Spanish Civil War, the degree to which Miro is really using the open start, right? The idea of automatic painting that is there well before anything that he's planning, right? So he's got smearings of paint everywhere. Lower left corner is the most obvious place. You can see that it looks like he's coming back in just with a rag, maybe, that's been dragged in some pigment and making these sort of swirling patterns. You can almost see his fingers inside the rag. Doing that up above, paint put down in areas, some of it smeared, some of it blotched, rubbed together. I don't know the order in which this is put on. Some of it seems to be before the drawn lines and some of it afterwards. And then giving it this title of Shooting Star, which is itself evocative of the celestial world, right? Of the firmament, the heavens in an astrological sense, right? And at the same time, there's a human figure involved, right? And it's obviously a very stylized human figure, but it's a very strange one as well, because it looks like we have a head at the top. Can you make that out okay? In that sort of strange trapezoid triangle, right? But there are facial features indicated on it. Not precisely drawn, in fact, drawn very immaturely on purpose. We saw with the farm, and the man knew how to draw, right? That's not that he doesn't know how. But he's making it childlike on purpose. And again, that I think relates back to Freud and his ideas about where do we find our true selves, right? Through childhood. And then the neck becomes this long black element that comes down to a pair of shoulders and hands up to the sides. And then we come down further and it rests on a pair of legs that don't really attach well, right? But are evoked by those two red forms at the bottom. And then behind it is the shooting star, right? So it's a figure in the landscape, if you will, a figure who, it's not just the shooting star, it's a reaction to the shooting star, right? Oh my goodness, a shooting star. And going back to ancient times, right? Going back to ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, right? Shooting stars were seen as omens. Usually omens that something bad was going to happen. Because the heavens, which were seen as permanent, were falling. Right? So meteors, comets, all seen as signs that the world is unstable, that the apocalypse is coming. Right? The end of the world. Okay? And for Miro, he's using that metaphor, obviously, as one related to the war in his home country, even though he's in Paris, right, at this time. So our shooting star here causes awe in the people that look on. And you'll notice that behind the larger figure, there's a smaller one as well. He often includes two figures, mother and child, sometimes he'll call them, right, mother and daughter even, looking at the shooting star. So there's another small one back there. Now, all of that said, there's also something, and this becomes clear if you look at enough Miro. And we're not going to look at enough Miro to get this across, so I'm going to ask you to take my word for it. It's eroticized as well. And it's not hard to see with the central figure and the large head that there's something there that looks kind of like a scrotum in the middle of the chest, a pair of balls, right? And there's that very prominent V shape right at the base of that incredibly long neck, right? And then down below, when we get down toward the legs, there's another black part that might also begin to suggest pubic hair. Now, if we look at enough Miro, this stuff becomes clear. There was this big show called The Ladder of Escape in, 2011 or so at the National Gallery. And I went there with Kovac from the philosophy department. And we came out of it going like, I didn't realize that every single Miro painting was vaginas and penises. But they are. And because once you realize what he has a language of form that reappears again and again in his pictures. And once you start to trace how he gets to those forms and what they mean, it's like, oh, there it is again. Oh, there it is over there, right? And so the incredibly elongated neck is kind of on purpose as a phallic symbol, right? And it comes down, and then there you've got the scrotum below it. But the V shape makes it transgendered, if you will, right? Androgynous, in that V shape that you see, we see reappearing often in Miro's paintings. And in this case, it's called circus horse, but again, you get the sense of the open start, right? The circus horse is being trained, right? What is a circus horse? But a wild animal that's being made to do tricks. And when you see a horse in the circus or any kind of circus animal, you see the animal and you see the trainer who's like, cracking the whip, and they'll go stand on their hind legs on that drum, right? Or jump through that hoop or whatever. Right? That's the experience he's trying to evoke here. So he gives us the open plain, if you will, of the brown of the canvas becomes that, the middle ring of the three-ring circus. Where there's nothing on the ground, right? Because circus, right, is all about suspending disbelief. They closed Barnum and Bailey this year. You hear that? The Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus is no more. Thank you, Netflix, right? Yeah, I know. Who's going to run? Where are you going to run off when you're a little kid anymore if you can't run off to the circus, right? I have to admit that I haven't been to a circus since I was like 4 years old, probably, I know. I have this, but you see, it's romantic. I have a very romantic idea about it. Heck with the animals. Sorry? No.
Oh, okay. So you should have the same reaction.
But I do like aquariums and zoos. I love the zoo. I come out of when I was studying for my orals, right? My grad program was right across the 78th and 5th in New York, right across the street from the Central Park Zoo. And you had to pay to go in the zoo, but you could see into the zoo very clearly from 5th Ave at about 65th Street. So I was studying for my orals every day, starting at 7 in the morning until about 9 at night. I was in the books because I had this big oral exam at the end of the semester that I had to prepare for. They could show me any work of art. I had to be able to talk about it. even if I didn't know what it was, right? They'd show me anything. I got to pare it down to like only 3 centuries. Anyway, every day at about 4 o'clock, I'd been there already for like 8 hours, and I would go down. This has nothing to do with this. I'd go down to Central Park Zoo and I'd watch them feed the dolphins. Because the dolphins knew it was almost 4 o'clock, just like my dogs at home know when it's feeding time. Right? And they started to like go around the pool and jump, And it was just the greatest thing to go watch them those days. I've been reading books all day and go see something alive. Even if it's in a pen. They were so happy. Let's go back to Miro. Let's go back to the circus horse. Okay, so in this case, it's evoking a circus where, in many ways, right, at the circus, a lot of experience in the circus is a suspension of disbelief, Margaret. Maybe about the abuse that the animals have suffered in order to, because what's an elephant doing on a skateboard, right? It's not like something they're supposed to be doing. But in addition to that, there's no stagecraft, right? It's theater without stage. Because there's no scenography there. It's just a dirt circle, right? There might be a few props, but the props are there specifically for what the animal's doing as a performance, okay? So Miro kind of evokes that because it was this big blank slate, right? Now that's something he likes to do anyway. But we have now our circus horse. So this is a performing horse, and you can make out the horse shape on the right. Big black nose, right? The idea that maybe the horse is holding something up, maybe a ball on the end of his nose or something. But you'll also notice it's a male horse and he's excited, right? Now, who's the trainer? That same V shape that we see in the shooting star. What do you think that is? Right? What part of the anatomy of either gender does that look like? Do I have to spell it out, right? What has caused the horse to become excited? The male horse is excited by a symbol of the female, in this case. And again, surrounded by these celestial bodies, right? Moon, sun, stars. None of them drawn out as clearly as early in his works, but they're there, right? It's this ladder of escape is a ladder of ecstasy, right? And if you think about the places where one escapes the doldrums of everyday life, well, ecstasy is one of them. Ecstatic states. And Miro comes back to this theme again and again. So once you start to see this and realize that the simple language of forms really kind of means something to Miro, then you start to pick up on where it appears and reappears in his works. But always with the idea that the art is a conduit for you. It's your ladder of escape, right? It's what allows you to see past the physical world that you're very familiar with into something entirely different, right? So a woman and a little girl in front of the sun has these strange things again and again. You'll notice this language of form, right? This very basic language of form that appears and reappears. Again, open starts, staining the canvas, right? Rubbing into it various forms, things that end up looking almost like Japanese or Chinese characters on either side. But again, elements that evoke both non-eroticized body parts and then eroticized body parts. So we have this head with the 4 eyes, 2 mouths, 2 chins. So we've got 2 people there, kind of. But at the same time, it's not just one person seen multiple times, because there's another face down here, a much more simple one, that's red and gray, right, with the X's on it and the little smiley face cocked to the side, looking significantly more innocent. There's our V shape, now upended, forming the body of, I presume to be that head, right? The eyes now on the head, the 2 chins, and then off the top of the head, very similar to the shooting star, we have this elongated neck, which again quite obviously becomes a phallus in a couple of different ways, right? Places where he's appended those double circles to suggest male sexual member, right? So he's doing this again and again, and then And it's in 3 dimensions, right? It's just this big splotch of white paint down there. That is the only thick paint on the entire surface of the canvas, right? Looking like, yeah. So, right, and then again, remember let's go back, right? And I'll clean this up a little bit for you, right? Make it more tolerable. What does Freud, one of the things that Freud says that we as adults do is that we sublimate true desire. That we have things that we really want, but we don't ever really address it. And that sublimation of desire is what causes much of the anxiety that we experience day in and day out. That a lot of the problems that we have in dealing with life come from the fact that we are not being honest with our desires. And that those desires are often, sexual desires, but other kinds as well. And that to understand the root of those, we need to understand what is the root of those desires, right? So dream therapy allows us to identify what those desires might actually be. And going back to our childhood allows us to identify why we want them so badly. Right? This is why Freud is often stuck on Oedipus complexes and things like that, right? Okay, so the fact that Miro is so wrapped up in this very eroticized language of abstract form, right? Very highly erotically charged, goes back to this Freudian and thus surrealist push toward sex lying at the root of everything. And this is part of the reason we saw with Dada as well, didn't we? That for Duchamp especially, kind of sex was always there. Sex was there in machinery, This is part of the reason I started this class with symbolism. Because that's kind of where those ideas first started to percolate out. Gauguin, right? Started to really percolate out these ideas of subliminated sexual desire being one of the catalysts for human activity. Because that's when Freud was alive, 1890s, same time as symbolism. So, this is why symbolists become somebody, even though they're 19th century art movement, become somebody that's better to talk about in the context of modern art than to talk about in the context of impressionist art, because they really do, those ideas continue to sort of bubble through the rest of 20th century art. Other painters, right? So like I said, we're not going to have enough time to look at as many Miros as I would like. I chose, by the way, from Miro, the most obviously eroticized ones. This simplified language of form that he has with these anamorphic shapes floating around in an environment reappear everywhere, and sometimes they're much more subtle, much less obvious as metaphors for something else. Other artists are using very similar languages of form, but in a way that you wouldn't confuse for Miro. So Yves Tanguy is there in Paris at exactly the same time as Miro, as this sort of surrealist revolution in Parisian art kind of takes over everything. And he's really the one that's responsible for the thing that we often associate with surrealism, which is this dream landscape, this quasi-nocturnal kind of landscape that we saw some, we saw some sort of preview of it with Miro's Farm, right? But here we kind of associate this, right? It's this landscape, it looks like it's kind of night, but it isn't, and there's these forms floating around it, right? And you can see that what he's done is he's taken some forms that look very much like some of Miro's forms, and he's rendered them as sort of three-dimensional objects that float in space. So you've got that brownish thing in the lower left corner that casts a shadow, right? And this landscape, it could be underwater, right? It could be night. It could be a darkened end of the day. There's another blue one in the back that seems to be floating above. And then this thing on the right that has, it's almost like he's been looking through the microscope, at microbes and seeing these things that aren't visible. And I would imagine that for a surrealist, like this reminds me, this would be the greatest thing in the world, right? Because it's proof positive that everything you think is really there. Because then you get to see these little things swimming around, right? All the mites that live on every one of us that we don't want to ever see pictures of, right? And you get to see with the, it's like, dude, that's in my hair, or, between my toes. I've got something like that alive in there, and we know that they're part of being alive, right? It's part of being part of the system. And so you get the sense with Tanguy that he's been looking at these sorts of things, right? And now he's bringing them forth in this fairly large canvas, about 4 feet tall, right? And in addition to those fairly tightly rendered biomorphic forms casting shadows, there are also areas that look as if they're, again, this automatic painting, right? Whether it's the cotton balls in between those microbes that also cast shadows onto the landscape, or more obviously on the left, where you can see over the top of the picture, there's that wave pattern that looks as if it's just been sort of scratched over the surface with a dry brush, right? And I love the way in which it looks like it's almost like one stroke that slowly disappears as it moves through the landscape. Or the stuff that's happening behind it or in front of it. Okay? It's a lunar landscape, isn't it? It's outer space in a way, which certainly relates back to what Miro is doing. This could be the, I just watched a documentary on Aardman Studios, the Wallace and Gromit people. Does that mean anything to anybody? No? Wallace and Gromit? Claymation, right? Remember when you go to the moon? The very first one, a grand day out, they go to the moon to see what Wallace wants cheese, right? What better place to go for cheese than the moon, right? And they go up there, and this could be the lunar landscape, right? Where it's brightly lit on the surface, but then dark in the sky. All of these things, whether it's dreams, underwater, the moon, they evoke a world that's different from ours, that's physical but isn't, right? Or at least it's not our physicality. And this is a hallmark of surrealism, right? Now, so far in surrealism, I've skipped the one guy you all know, right? Salvador Dali, okay? When we think surrealism, we think Salvador Dali. And with good reason. I mean, this is a pretty fantastic picture. It's awfully small. Up in MoMA, it's like this, like maybe 8 inches across, maybe, right? Whenever I go to MoMA, I'm amazed that even though I know it's small, it's smaller than I even remember it being. Sorry, not 8.5, it's 13 inches across. So still, it's the size of the paper that you're writing on, give or take, right? A relatively small picture. And Dali is certainly considered to be, it was certainly the most famous of all of the surrealists, for sure, right? But for my money, and I get to do this because I'm teaching. So you can teach a class and you can talk about how great he is. I'm going to talk about what a rip-off artist he is, right? How he's kind of a hack in a way, in that I don't think there's anything in Dali that we haven't seen already. Anamorphic forms that are transforming in front of our eyes from one thing into the next, that's Miro. If we think about the farm. And Dali doesn't arrive in Paris until like 1929, right? So surrealism had been around already for a good 5 years as an official movement by the time Dali arrives in 1929. He kind of breathes new life into it, It sort of started to wane out. Dali arrives and it kind of re-kickstarts. So I'll give him that, right? But the soft biomorphic forms, Tanguy, the dream landscape, we've seen that already, right? This quasi-nocturnal day for night sort of landscape that could be the end of the day. It could also be a dream landscape. It also has a sense of almost being underwater. These broad, flat playing fields against which the forms are arranged. We've seen that as well, right? Maybe not laid out in this respect, flat against, but Miro gave us those forms as actors, if you will, in a drama on a stage. So we have a lot of that already taking place. And I'm dissing Dali, right? But I like this early stuff. I kind of like the stuff right around 1930, before he started just cranking stuff out to sell. Like that Last Supper picture we have at the National Gallery, which I think is a piece of junk. But it's big. I'll give him that. It's big, right? Yeah. And you know, they don't have the guts to put it somewhere. That could easily go where the Max Ernst picture is that we looked at on Friday. That really wonderful with the birds, about the same size, right? But Max Ernst is kind of like, you know, I'm not going to go there. Okay. For Dali here with the this very, very famous picture, The Persistence of Memory. He's the guy that we most associate this idea of the surrealist dream landscape with, and because he repeats it again and again and again. Right? He said about his pictures that he was mining a number of his childhood memories, mining his own dreams. One of the things that's sort of interesting about this is that he was the second son to his parents, and his older brother had died before he was born. His older brother's name was Salvador, and they gave the second son the dead son's name. So he went through his entire life thinking of himself as being a replacement figure, right? The one that stood in for somebody else. And as you might imagine, the memories of childhood, right, are going to be, we saw that with Miro. Memories of childhood are a distinctly important element for our surrealist artists. And for Dali, they bring up issues of identity. Who am I? And that might help to explain why Dali really marketed himself as a mask of sorts, right? As a figure who you became very aware of what he looked like as being part of his art, was his own presentation of self-image, right? With the mustache that comes out to here, you know, his big old hook nose, hats and whatnot. Well, with the idea that he's interested in mining his childhood, in the background we see part of the Spanish coastline near where he was born, right? And this part of the I've got some pictures of it. It's pretty fantastic. The Cap de Cruz has these little volcanic rock formations that are absolutely fantastic and that look biomorphic, that already in nature perform this thing that the surrealists are trying to do, which is to take one form and have it become something entirely different, right? So, right, this is not carved or anything. This is just the way it looks, and he grew up near here, the Cap de Cruz. And some of the forms that appear in his pictures are actually directly here. In fact, I've not been to Spain, but I've seen pictures of this, and there's apparently a Dali path running through the park. And they have pictures, reproductions of Dali's pictures, you know, laminated, and you can look at the rock and look at the picture and go, oh, that's here, right? So in this case, if we look at this thing in the foreground with the melted watch over it, this slug-like form, right, that's laying on the ground, you can see there's a certain similarity to the basic form of these different rocks, right? And so those are part of what he's mining as he's working with this. Is if you think about it, these are part of his background. That means, what does the title mean? This evocative title, The Persistence of Memory. Memory lasts, right? It's a very Freudian idea. Memory persists through the entirety of our lives and dictates who we are. So he's going to mine in what are those memories that have lasted for Salvador Dali. In this case, the Cap de Cruz is part of that, right? The area where he grew up, this kind of creepy lunar landscape, right, of volcanic forms. At the same time, if we flip it 90 degrees, you can tell it's the profile. It's a face, it's a rubber mask that's been discarded. And you can start to see the nose, right, the eye. Nothing's exactly where it's supposed to be. There's something coming out of the nose, right? That might be where the mouth would be. But this is a self-portrait of Dali, right? I couldn't find one in profile. But you'll notice that even there he's adopted the Miro-like strands for the mustache that looked very much like what we saw in the Catalan peasant, are picked up here. Softness seems to be a theme everywhere, as do ants and insects. This is typical for Dali. And he sees the softness of the clocks as being the fact that time is itself not a fixed element. Time is not as firm of a definition as we think it is, right? That this is in fact soft. He also sees it as a form of decay, and that would account for the ants and the bugs crawling on it, like they do on rotten meat. Right? Is the idea that while he may title it the persistence of memory, when you title something that, you're going to investigate what is the persistence of memory. On a certain level, you also investigate how memory disappears, how memory doesn't persist, how memory rots, right? How memory dies. And so the soft watches, the two soft watches, plus the watch case, the red watch case here, being attacked by the ants, is the idea that at a certain level, some of our memories do disappear, right? Some of them persist and some of them disappear. And again, Freud would say, yes, but they haven't, right? Freud would say you think they've disappeared, but they're still active somewhere. You need to rediscover those. Come to grips with who you really are and what your issues are, even if you think you're the happiest person of life. This is a downer before Thanksgiving. Let's be thankful that we didn't have an older brother who died, whose name we were given, right? We'd be thankful for that, right? So, his most famous work. Now, we don't have a really good Dali in DC. The closest sort of Dali from this period when he's actually kind of invented is down in Richmond, the BMFA. The God of the Bay of Roses. This is another picture that evokes his childhood. The Bay of Roses is a particular area in Spain, again from this same basic region. So our landscape here is inspired by I don't know my Spanish topography well enough, right? But I believe it's the same basic region as the landscape that we see earlier in the persistence of memory. And what we have here is a huge rock outcropping isolated on this Dali-esque or Dali landscape, lit from outside in this strange artificial lighting that suggests dreams, right? Nightmares, or perhaps a nocturnal world. But strangely spotlit, and strange in that you'll notice the cast shadow, but there's still a shadow on the rock that's casting the shadow. Like something has cast a shadow onto it as well. But there are no shadow running across the foreground. This is what makes it so strange, right? And that shadow casting back into the background, and then paralleling that rock, and in fact in kind of the same proportions as that rock, is this idol on a plinth, right? This idol on a base. But you'll notice that the idol isn't on the base. It's floating close above it. But the basic form of the idol, with its shoulders turned to the right and the hand over the top of the head, evokes the basic proportions of that rock, where you can see that the long legs of the figure, where it transforms into the torso, are more or less mirrored by that cleft in the rock at about 2/3 of the way up. So, and statues, right, carved from rocks. So he's making these kind of associations. And what we have on the left is a series of figures who have gathered around now to worship that statue. Right? Now, the statue looks primarily like a real person, except that you'll notice the face has flipped from flesh tone back to the tone of stone, to the tone of marble. So you wonder if what we're seeing is not what the people around the base of the statue see in the statue, that their vision is bringing it to life. But you and I and Dali are reminded of the fact that it's a stone sculpture in the end. And to add to that, of course, is that hole in his chest, right, that allows us to see immediately. Through the hole where the heart should be is directly there. We've got a detail, right, that might help us see it a little bit better, right? So you can see now it's and what's also interesting is it's very androgynous, right? It's a male torso, but the face is very effeminate, right? That without the rest of the body, you would probably guess it was a woman, right? And then there's that cloud up above that seems to take on almost a solidity that echoes the form of not only the statue, the floating statue, but also that very solidly planted rock off to the right. Now, Dali's going to present us all this stuff, and he's not going to give us any answers, right? We shouldn't expect there to be some sort of key that says, okay, this is how everything fits together, and X equals Y equals Z. But rather that we're given these things that are meant to inspire us to think about where this might go from here, right? What are some of the associations that I might see different from Seth, who might see it different from Mary, right? Each one of us are going to bring something to it. But we have around the base, and I think that if I spend enough time on this, I could trace every one of these figures back to a Renaissance drawing somewhere. All of these figures who are worshiping, I recognize a few of them already, and if I really wanted to spend time doing this, if I gave a rip about Dali, I'd go for it. But suffice to say that he's probably been looking for these figures and finding them in various Renaissance prints, paintings, and so forth. That evoke now these worshipers gathered around this statue. The statue is, other than the hole in the heart, pristine, very smooth, whereas the plinth is this symbol of age and decay. Right? Again, themes that Dali has worked with elsewhere. Right? The idea of persistence versus decay, right, is a Dali theme. Softness versus hardness, another Dali theme that we've seen elsewhere. Right? And again, the God of the Bay of Roses. Now, I brought in some pictures of the Bay of Roses because I think it's kind of an important thing. I'm not saying anybody write about this, but I just sort of poked around. I did bring this stuff in for you. Right? Here's the Bay of Roses. And the interesting thing about the Bay of Roses is an old Greek shipping port there. The ruins of a Greek shipping port at the Bay of Roses. Right? So this bit that you're seeing here, leading up to the open space around here and out to that inlet, that's all part of a 7th century BC-ish Greek shipping port. The ruins of it, which were there in Dali's infancy, right? And if you poke around it far enough, you find really fascinating stuff. A statue looking out to sea. On a plinth, you see how to give you a sense of scale, right? Here. So our figure, I think, is not an illustration of this, but instead is inspired by this experience at the Bay of Roses, at the archaeological site that's there. And our figure with the hole through the chest, I couldn't help but think of this, right? At a certain point, walking through this amazing gate, right? Through which you can see more of the ruins. And the way that it opens up, the way that you can move through it, kind of reminds me of the chest on that figure, in a way, right? The portal through stone that gives you this view, this evocative view of more of the ruins beyond. And the interesting thing about that is, here, and what's that right there? A phallic symbol right next to the gate, right? Old Greek apotropaic device, right? A phallic symbol carved to, we talked about this, right? I made the Louis C.K. joke, right? A phallic symbol carved to ward off unwanted people. He's incorporated that right into his sculpture, right? So I think there's definitely something here insofar as this archaeological site and its relationship to Dali's image, that he's bringing back these very, very ancient ideas. Right? And again, for surrealism, mining the past to understand then who we are. Another artist who arrived in Paris at the end of the 20s and helped to revitalize surrealism is René Magritte. He's from Brussels, Belgium, right? And he moved down to Paris in 1929. So he, like Dali, is sort of the second wind of surrealism. But he's very different from Dali because he's not necessarily interested in the same sorts of things that Dali is interested in. And I think in many ways, he's not as much interested in dreams in the same way, in that sort of Freudian psychoanalytic way. He is interested in the way in which imagery, paintings, are not really what they seem to be. And this is surrealism in a nutshell, that much of what we see is not what it originally seems to be. That the painter's job is to reveal connections between the things we see and what they might mean, or to confront us with juxtapositions that make us question our presumptions. That's what it shares with Dada, right? Think of Duchamp, right? And the toilet, yeah? It makes you question what you're seeing and question your presumptions about it. So in this case, the human condition, number one, there's about 2 or 3 versions of this out there. We have the artist's painting in front of the window that inspired it. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. Magritte's way of illustrating is very hyper-realistic. At the same time, slightly artificial, right? Because it's been smoothed out a lot, kind of simplified a bit, but then within that simplicity, very precise in its rendering. And this is because Magritte had begun his career as a sign painter, a commercial sign painter. So back in the days when businesses used it, like an optician would have a big picture of eyeglasses hanging outside their shop. We got neon now, we don't need it, right? We've got the internet, we don't need it. But back in the day, early 20th century, if you were an optician, you'd have a pair of glasses. If you were a tobacconist, right, there'd be a cigarette or a pipe out there, hanging out there, right? If you were a doctor, right, there might be a stethoscope or something. Something that would tell people that this is the business that's located here, right? And we've lost that. We just don't really do that anymore, right? Although I love signs like that. They're really cool. And this is what Magritte started as a painter doing, right? Was painting these commercial signs that had to be very, very legible and very, very accurate in order to function at all. And he brings that training into then his fine art, which has that same precision of rendering the elements, right? And one of his most famous works is this one, which is really based on that experience. This is not a pipe in French. Ceci n'est pas une pipe, right? This here ain't a pipe. And this is, I think, and he calls it, the title he gives it is not that, but the treachery of images. The word he uses is treachery. There's 2 or 3 different translations of the word that he uses. Treachery is as good as perfidy. Do you know the word perfidy? It's a word we don't use that much, but what it basically means, as treachery does, is a more accurate and less poetic title would be the lying nature of images. That's what perfidy means, right? A nature that lies, okay? So it's not necessarily the lies of images, it's the fact that images do lie. It's their nature to lie, okay? So the treachery of images is the fact that they lie. And with this picture, giving it that title, this is not a pipe. It's not. It's a painting of a pipe, right? And it goes back to one of the things we've talked about with modern art in general, going back, to the 19th century, was what is a painting? A painting has 2 identities. And that we often think of the first identity, which is the lying identity, and that is that a painting is what it represents. So someone will come to you and they'll say, what's that, right? And you say, oh, it's a dog, right? Or it's a horse, or it's a tree, or it's a landscape. And it's not. It's a bunch of material skillfully arranged on the surface. That's what the picture is. That's its second nature, right? A picture is not what it represents. A picture is a physical object that the artist creates. That in many respects and in the history of art has represented something. But this is laid at the core of what we've talked about again and again in this class. Why do we move to abstract art? Because it's the realization that a painting is not what it represents. A painting is materials skillfully arranged by the artist. That's the true nature of art. That's the physical nature of art. So Magritte is pointing directly to this, right? This is not a pipe. This is a painting. Right? But rendered in that sign painter's realism that he learned and perfected before he ever came to Paris. Okay? This is not a pipe. Now, go back to our picture. That's what makes this picture so utterly fascinating, because it's in the same vein. What does the painter paint? What is the painting? The painting is something that comes out of the head of the artist based on things that he sees, that arrangement of forms. But what is it really? Is it representation? And this is what I think is really cool, because he suggests that it is. Right? It looks exactly like the landscape that it's arranged in front of. But that's what kind of makes it so fascinating, because how do you know, looking at this, and this is what Magritte wants you to think about, how do you know that there actually is a tree back there, behind the canvas? There's no proof that the bit of the landscape that's blocked by the canvas is the same as what we see on the canvas. Right? You don't even know if that path doesn't bend and go back. Right? There's no way to know, because it doesn't come out the other side. The far left, as you can see, made the canvas overlap the curtain just a little bit. So you don't know if that path goes straight, or if that's something the artist chose to alter based on what he saw. And so with surrealism, right, is this idea of works that make you sort of question the way you engage with the physical reality around you, right? And that's how it kind of fits in, but it doesn't have that same sort of Freudian creepiness, right? Veiled, icky, body fluid sexuality that we saw in other artists, right? It's in a very different way. And he has all these tricks that he does, right? At the bottom, he makes the blades of grass line up with the blades of grass outside the window. So he's suggesting that, yes, it's very precise, it's very exact. It is exactly the same as what the clouds line up, right? At the edge, at the top. The leaves of that bush line up, right? Do I have another detail of this? I do, I think, even better. Right, and like I said, the grass is almost blade for blade, lining up at the bottom row of this. But that tree doesn't have to necessarily be there, right? Because there's no way to prove it. The only way to know that the tree is outside is because it's on the painter's canvas, which is absolutely fascinating, right? As this form that takes us up. Okay, so that's basically, in a nutshell, that's sort of the brunt of surrealism, leading from 24 to the mid-30s, right? Picked up and morphed in different ways by these artists, Dali, Tanguy, and Miro being sort of the main thrust of things, right? But then we have this side thrust with Magritte, who's kind of out there by himself, and continues to do work similar to this all the way into the 1960s, right? As you might imagine, surrealism as a new art form in the 1930s, late 20s and early 30s, would have wider impact. One of the artists who picks up on surrealism is Kandinsky. Right? Kandinsky comes to Paris in 1933. He's fleeing the Nazis. Right? He'd been working at the Bauhaus. The Nazis closed the Bauhaus in 1931. Everybody kept hoping that Nazi power would fade. When it became apparent it didn't, many of the artists from Germany left for other places. to the benefit of the schools of art in those other regions. And Kandinsky in 1933 flees Germany for Paris, right? Became a French citizen eventually, lives there through the end of the 1930s, and I think you can see here, Miro made a huge impact on him. These biomorphic forms that we saw in Miro's painting, that we saw in Tanguy's painting, get picked up by Kandinsky and arranged into his own sort of musical notations that reads very much as if it were a sheet of music, which for Kandinsky is something we've seen throughout his career, right? But at the same time, he talks, obviously, in the Bauhaus era, about how each of the individual forms, and this was true even back early when the horse meant so much to him, right? But later, circles and squares mean a lot to him. That forms and colors have deeper associations. And this lifelong investigation for Kandinsky of the relationship between form and metaphysics would have made him deeply interested in surrealism. A new take on what he'd been doing all of his life, for 30 years by this point. And he starts to make these really gorgeous biomorphic forms that dance across the page, again, like biological samples on a slide, right? Each one picking up its own life. The background, by the way, painted every bit as much as the foreground, right? It's not as easy as just laying down white and coming over the top of it, right? But forms that dance everywhere we look throughout, and then carry this idea of being things that are meant to help us, like they did in Miro's paintings, help us transcend the physical realm that we live in and move on to something greater, something above our everyday existence. One last detail from this, and that's at 1:15. I've got one other artist to talk about that's not necessarily a surrealist, so it'll make a nice bridge at the beginning of the next class as we move to America, so to speak. For the last sort of 4 classes, as we'll spend a lot of time in America. I'm debating on whether or not I want to show you what happened to Picasso during this period, because he picks up on surrealism as well. That might enter into it before we jump back to America, right? But we've got a couple of other major people to look at here as we move into abstract expressionism. And that should be kind of, I think, where the class winds up, is with the abstract expressionist painters. I doubt we'll get to pop art. We'll knock wood, we'll see. This weekend, I know, right? This weekend, I plan to work on a slide sheet, right? A study sheet for the final, because we're that close now. And what will probably happen, and I want to warn you about this ahead of time, is it will be longer than what we get through. I would rather give you a longer slide sheet and cut it back than add to it later at the last minute. So what it will do will be, like in an ideal world, if I talk really fast and never pick up, that will be what's on the slide list. Or talk about the circus, right? Get distracted by you guys and your questions. You guys and your questions. Like I'm here to help you learn anything. Anyway, I will make it longer than it will probably end up being longer. Okay, so just if you see it this weekend, you're like, holy crud! Again, just look at the first part of it because we don't know how far we're going to get. Okay?
Sir, are you sending back the data?
I am.
This week?
Yes. Yeah. I would do it this afternoon, but now I've got to go frame some works of art for the library. So, yes, I will be sending that back very soon. Okay? Thank you for reminding me on that, Elaine. I appreciate it.